It was summertime in Alberta, and I had a job interview. I had started my master's degree, and I was about to get married, and I needed some summer employment. I mentioned I was a student, so my prospective boss asked what I was studying. I said theology. He replied that he was an atheist. The response I came up with: some of my best friends are atheists. It was an odd comment, but true. 15 years ago, debates about atheism were big. Authors like Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, and Christopher Hitchens had all written best-selling books condemning religion. One of my closest friends, I was in his wedding party and he would be in mine, was really into the new atheists, and we would discuss their arguments regularly. We didn't change each other's minds very much, but I enjoyed our conversations. What strikes me now is how binary those debates were. Do you believe in God? Yes or no? Are you an atheist? Yes or no? These questions didn't recognize people's journeys, the mingling of doubt and faith over time. Or if they do, they presume a clear direction. Either you're gaining faith or losing it. Keeping that in mind, let's look at our passage today, which, if you want to follow along, is John chapter 20, verses 19 through 31. Starting with verse 19, we see that the disciples were hiding for fear of the Judeans. This is a better translation than what is more common, which is for fear of the Jews. In many translations, John's gospel makes many blanket comments about the Jews, comments which will later be used by Christians to justify terrible atrocities. How to rightly read these comments is a complex question, but it reminds me a little bit of when I'm in a car and I see something snide about Toronto drivers. I am a Toronto driver, but I'm not like one of those drivers, okay? John's comments about the Jews are a little bit like that. Since the Jewish leaders were critical of Jesus' followers like him, he's indulging in the very human tendency to distance himself and his friends from the Jews or Judeans. Anyway, the disciples are hiding in fear. This makes sense because they recently saw their leader, Jesus, crucified for sedition. However, you may recall from last Sunday, Easter Sunday, that in the verses right before this, Peter and John found the tomb empty, and Mary Magdalene had an entire conversation with the risen Jesus. Mary then told the disciples about this, but they were still afraid. Why? I've never had a friend killed, much less a close friend and mentor. But from what I understand, losing a friend to violence is a profoundly traumatic experience. And profound trauma isn't fixed by a few days off or even a month in therapy. It can take years to process and release some of the emotional damage done by violence, especially if it's state-sponsored violence that will never be persecuted. So I don't judge the disciples for still being afraid. That fear, I think, makes Jesus' words even more striking. In verse 19, again in verse 21, and a third time in verse 26, Jesus says, "Peace be with you." These words may be familiar. Every Sunday, Anglicans and other Christians around the world exchange this peace, and the response is, "and also with you." When I first heard this phrase used in church, I thought it was just a nice way to wish your neighbor well. Later, I read an explanation that this exchange shows that we are at peace with each other. I think both of these are true and good reasons to pass the peace, as we call it. But reading these words here, spoken by Jesus to his frightened and traumatized disciples, they hit a little bit harder, don't they? He's reassuring them. He's saying, don't be afraid. It's okay. Why is it okay? Because his crucifixion isn't the end of the story. In fact, all this is just the beginning of a bigger story. Jesus goes on to say in verse 21, "As the Father has sent me, so I am sending you." A big question in the first century was not, does God exist, but how do we participate in what God is doing? The options were align with those in power, withdraw to the desert, repay Roman violence in kind, or return to God's teachings. Jesus affirmed the last option, and he went beyond it. He said, go. Go out into the world and share the good news with everyone. Or as this passage puts it, I am sending you. Receive the Holy Spirit. This mission gets pretty weighty in verse 23. If you forgive the sins of any, they are forgiven them. If you retain the sins of any, they are retained. Pretty heavy, Jesus. Also, I wonder, how does this work? Isn't forgiving sins your job? If we don't forgive someone, does that mean that you won't? To be honest, I think this seems like a bad system, given how hard it can be for us, or me at least, to forgive people. I like the way another translation puts this verse. The First Nations version is an indigenous translation of the New Testament. That's quite good. Verse 23 in its version is, if you release others from their bad hearts and broken ways, they are released. If you do not release them, they are not released. Put another way, Jesus is telling his disciples that they have the power to go out and free people from their bad intentions and destructive habits. In Jesus' day, that could sometimes be accomplished just by telling people they were forgiven. Nowadays, after so many debates about the existence of God and whether religion is any good, sharing this good news can be complicated. But bad hearts and broken ways still exist. People still need freedom and healing, and that's still something Jesus says we can help with. Then in verse 24, we get to the Apostle Thomas. Thomas has a mixed reputation. In the early church, he was declared a saint, and there are many churches named after him, especially in India. But 16th century Protestant reformer and influencer John Calvin mocked Thomas. He called him stupid and obstinate. Unfortunately, many Christians have adopted Calvin's view of Thomas, and even to this day, you can hear suggestions that those who reject Christianity are dumb or stubborn. I think this negative portrayal is challenged if we read Thomas's backstory. Earlier in John, in chapter 11, Jesus learns that his friend Lazarus is sick. He tells the disciples that they need to go back to Judea, and they reply, I'm paraphrasing, "Teacher, are you crazy? They just tried to kill you." But Thomas tells his fellow disciples, "Let's go with Jesus so that we may die with him." Thomas is no coward. He's committed. He's fully prepared to die alongside Jesus. Later, in John 14, Thomas asks Jesus a question that he suggests he doesn't quite get where Jesus is going. But to be fair, that's true of all the disciples. They're not stupid. They're just struggling to grasp Jesus' new and strange claims about what he was doing. With the benefit of 2 millennia of hindsight, we can be tempted to think we would have got it faster than they did. But that's only because we've read ahead in the book, a book that hadn't been written yet for them. Knowing Thomas's backstory helps us understand what's happening in this passage. Look at verse 24 again. Thomas was not with them when Jesus came. Why not? Well, the other disciples were hiding in fear, we know that much, but Thomas wasn't. The text doesn't say what he was doing, but given his willingness to accompany Jesus to his death, I wonder. It could be that he had given up, but it could also be that he was still trying to publicly follow Jesus, resigned to the fact that he too might end up liquidated by the Roman killing machine. Then in verse 25, after the other disciples tell him they saw Jesus, Thomas says he needs to see for himself. Again, we could read this, like Calvin, as Thomas being arrogant. But I suspect that he thinks his companions are in denial. We know that trauma affects different people in different ways. Thomas has decided that what's best is to accept the brutal death of their teacher. It happened, it was bad, it can't be changed. Accept it, move on. A reasonable response. Then Jesus appears again. This time, Thomas is with the other disciples. Does he call his questioning disciples stupid and obstinate? No. He gives Thomas exactly what he asked for. Look at my hands, Jesus says. Touch my scars. Jesus is risen, but his body still shows evidence of the wounds inflicted by the Romans. It's proof that the crucifixion happened. It was bad. And in a way, it can't be changed. And yet, it isn't the end of the story. God is still at work, now telling a new story of resurrection. Jesus chides Thomas a little bit. He says, "Do not doubt, but believe." And from that we get the phrase, doubting Thomas. But notice how Thomas responds. He says, "My Lord and my God." In John's entire gospel, all 21 chapters, Thomas is the only person to call Jesus my God. And he's only the second person, after Mary Magdalene, to call Jesus my Lord. This is an exceptional expression of faith, one of the high points of the entire gospel. Among all the disciples, it was Thomas's questions that led him to have this deep and profound insight into who Jesus was. What does that mean for us? Well, the term Christian hadn't been invented yet, and Thomas wasn't an atheist either. He was just a follower of Jesus. He was at times courageous, confused, faithful, and questioning. We don't all have to be like Thomas. Peter, John, and Mary all had their own different responses. But if your journey looks like Thomas's journey, take heart. Doubting or not, Thomas was a saint.